special community with a special function. And I am currently, yes, TMTC research fellow. I'm also a pastor. And I had to think, my goodness, I don't know what the church that I'm at currently, if there's anyone here from Sterling, this is going to be especially interesting to hear their pastor talking about no more discernment. I'm currently part of several discernment processes. And so there is some nuance to my critique. And it's not to say that looking for the leading of the Holy Spirit is not important. I think it's very important. But there's some history with the word discernment and the harm that process has done that I want to get at and talk about a constructive framework for how to move forward. So, and also I wanted to say, and some of you heard this, but it made it my summary and abstract made it sound like I have this all figured out, and I actually don't. So this is a wonderful opportunity for you to think about your own experiences with discernment. I'm sure there are many. What that word signals to you about power and your experiences. We'll have time to engage those, and I welcome them. So this is an opportunity for you to add and enrich a conversation. So I'm sharing my screen with you now, and as Kyle mentioned, I cannot see you if you have a question, but I will have a specific time for questions. So hopefully also I don't lose an internet connection and have no clue, but we'll give it a go and see what happens. So there's my title again. And this is taken from my initial summary of what I said I would be doing here today. So I'm just going to reread this paragraph for you. The word discernment has a long history among Anabaptist Mennonites, as well as in academic ecclesiological methods for ethics, which are also referred to as witness ethics or integrity-based approaches to Christian ethics. You might think of Hauerwas or Yoder. In my previous work, I've explored the problems with such approaches, including the ways in which discernment can function as a cover for existing and unequal relationships of power, to function under the guise of equality. Think a vision of the priesthood of all believers, without critical attention to power in the church. As a result, discernment has acquired a negative and even traumatic connotation for those whose voices have been ignored or silenced by such processes. So here's a little more about the harms of discernment in case this is new to you, or it's just a helpful reminder. And this comes from the work of Stephanie Crable. She writes, Mennonites have little in the way of doctrine. What they do have are committees, some of which are called discernment groups. Listening committees are a regular feature of Mennonite discernment, particularly in the realm of LGBTQ people, who in the course of the 40-year history of their organizing within Mennonite contexts have often been invited to, quote, share their stories, end quote, in front of appointed listeners. I don't believe I know any LGBTQ Mennonites for whom the word discernment fails to produce groans, eye rolls, and other expressions of deep cynicism. For them, discernment about whether they are acceptable to the church has rarely yielded anything more than promises for more discernment. Carol Wise, director of the 40-year-old Brethren Mennonite Council on LGBTQ Interests, speaks of the violence of process in Mennonite practice. In Mennonite theology, God speaks not through divinely appointed individuals, but through community. In order to decide how God is speaking in a given situation, Mennonites engage in the process of discernment. The question we need to ask is, who is worthy of being in the room when the discernment takes place? And whose claims to truth can be heard as the voice of God? So another example of this, as many of you likely know, is the Being a Faithful Church process that Mennonite Church Canada went through, and proof of the harm that that process caused to LGBTQ Mennonites and their family and friends, and I would say to the whole church, is evidenced by a response that came from such people, and then this apology that acknowledged it. So this is an apology that Mennonite Canada issued after hearing from people who were upset about how that discernment process went. They acknowledged that despite their sustained effort to include LGBTQ Mennonites in the process, LGBTQ individuals bear testimony to being ignored, verbally abused, and silenced at times during the Being a Faithful Church volumes 1 to 7 process. Despite our best planning, we can see now how past decisions and actions limited LGBTQ experiences and perspectives from being heard in our documents, as well as in the planning and leading of assemblies. We sincerely regret and apologize for the actions and decisions within our body that caused such testimony to emerge. We confess that at times the body of Christ did not act like his body. And we might ask ourselves, what part of the body of Christ was that? Because there again, we see kind of an assumption that we are all one, and we all have a shared experience and equal access. While we recognize that hurtful words were expressed by persons from various perspectives, we acknowledge that the dominant group needs to take primary responsibility for failure of loving dialogue. And there's another buzz, 2 words, that could really stand to be unpacked, of course. Loving dialogue, and how has that functioned? Therefore, the General Board of Mennonite Church Canada apologizes to our LGBTQ members, as well as their family and friends, for those mistakes. So, my main focus is wanting to turn from doing that critical work to a critical constructive work, and to talk about a different way of framing things. So again, summarizing what I outlined, I would say, so I'll note it's going to be slightly different. My recent attempts to articulate and practice an alternative to discernment is what I want to talk about. This work grows out of the consultation I did with a local Mennonite congregation, seeking to grapple with the sexual and gender diversity of its members. My approach is informed by Melinda Berry's emphasis on circle process and nonviolent communication in her Shalom political theology, and grounded in my commitment to liberative feminist Christian ethics. I suggest a model focused on listening, identifying core values, and that uses circle sharing. I will also share about my experience with how technology can enable greater participation from voices not typically heard. So yes, some of those things, but also I'm going to do some slightly different things that are going to get at a similar constructive response. Ethics as storytelling is really where I want to spend time framing this move that I want to make. I want to see us be reminded of the fact that knowledge is interpreted and that power is shaped in narrative. So ethics as storytelling, with the potential to form and malform the character of our communities. So we'll come back to discernment after we talk about ethics as storytelling. All knowledge is interpreted and tells a particular narrative. The question is, what are our guiding narratives? What stories shape us and why? How have they been used to harm? For example, stories told about the quote-unquote other, the racialized other, the sexualized other, the classed other, the disabled other, the gendered other, etc. So here, a go-to source of mine has become Thomas King. And in particular, I want to draw on his Massey lecture series, The Truth About Stories. King conveys the value and power of story, both fictional stories as well as the stories of our lives, our experiences, and how we interpret them. The stories we tell, he says, create our world and us. Stories are therefore both wondrous and dangerous. In some, stories are all that we are, and what we do with them is our own decision. And this is from the back cover of the collection of his Massey lecture series. Native culture has deep ties to storytelling, and yet no other North American culture has been the subject of more erroneous stories. The Indian of fact, as King says, bears little resemblance to the literary Indian, the dying Indian, the construct so powerfully and often destructively projected by white North America. We learn from King how stories shape human understanding, for better and worse. They form and malform. He calls us to listen to the stories he tells. In his lecture, What Is It About Us That You Don't Like?, King analyzes legislation in Canada and the US that has resulted in the loss of treaty land, resources, and identity for Indigenous people. And now he does so as he parallels his version of a traditional coyote story in which coyote gains an entire coat's worth of feathers from some ducks. What is the story being told? By whom? What difference does it make? These are questions that he has us ask in relation to this story. So I wanted to read for you a bit of this story. And I'm going to stop presenting for this so I can see you and feel connected. So this is an example of a story and how narrative and who tells the story can shape our understanding and potentially our ethics. The truth about stories is that that's all we are. There are stories that take 7 days to tell. There are other stories that take you all your life. I like coyote stories, and one of my favorites is the one about Coyote and the ducks. Not the one where the ducks dance around with their eyes shut while Coyote grabs them one by one and tosses them in his hunting bag. And not the one where he tries to talk the ducks into teaching him how to fly. The other one, the one about feathers. And it goes like this. In the days when everything was beginning and animals were still talking to humans, Coyote had a beautiful fur coat of which he was very vain. Every day, Coyote would come down to the river and look at his reflection. Goodness, but I have a lovely coat, Coyote would whisper to the water, and then he would give himself a hug. One day, while he was admiring his fur coat, he saw 6 ducks singing and dancing and swimming around in circles. Back and forth they went, spinning and turning and diving and leaping in the sunshine. Now in those days, ducks had lovely long feathers that shimmered and flashed like the northern lights. And when the ducks had finished singing and dancing and swimming around in circles, they carefully cleaned each feather and straightened it and fluffed it up so that it glowed even more than before. "This is certainly a wonderful song," said Coyote, who was a little dizzy from watching the ducks swim around in circles. "And that is certainly a beautiful dance." "Yes," said the ducks, "we sing to keep everything in balance, and we dance for peace and generosity, and we swim around in circles to remind everyone of our relationship to the earth." "And those are certainly lovely feathers," said Coyote. "Yes," said those ducks, "they certainly are. I would certainly like to have one of those lovely feathers," said Coyote. "It would go so well with my excellent fur coat." Now in those days, ducks were very agreeable. "All right then," they said, "just be careful with it, for we are quite fond of our feathers." "I will," said Coyote, and he stuck the feather behind his left ear and ran off to show it to his friends. "What do you think of my feather?" he asked everyone. "It certainly is unusual," said Bear, who tended to be more critical than he needed to be. "Too bad you only have one for now. You look a little lopsided." "Oh dear," said Coyote, and he ran back to the river to find the dancing ducks. "Excuse me," Coyote shouted, "would it be possible to get another feather?" "Another feather?" said the ducks. "Yes," said Coyote. "As you can see, having only one makes me appear lopsided." "Ah," said the ducks, "you're right, you do look a little lopsided," and the ducks gave Coyote another feather. "But this is the last one," they said. "Don't ask for any more. We need our feathers." And it goes on, and of course the Coyote asks for more and more feathers and doesn't take good care of them. In fact, he takes most of their feathers, and then the human beings come into the story, and they want to take from Coyote, and the ducks wonder also why the human beings don't like the ducks. They interpret it as not liking them by wanting their feathers through Coyote. So they ask, "What is it about us that they don't like?" And Coyote says, "Oh, they like you well enough," said Coyote. "They just like your feathers better." And so Thomas King goes on and says, "Now I could finish this story, but you already know what's going to happen, don't you? The ducks are going to keep giving up their beautiful long feathers, Coyote is going to make a mess of things, the world is going to change, and no one is going to be particularly happy. Besides, this particular story is a long one that takes days to tell, and some are much shorter, like the ones we tell ourselves about injustices and atrocities." So it's a particular telling of a particular story that highlights certain power dynamics and certain understandings. And I could give more examples, and we could look to scripture for more examples. And we could think about creation stories and the difference between different cosmologies and creation stories and their impact on how we view the world, which in turn affects how we view our relationships with each other. And with Thomas King's story telling about Coyote, we think too, who is the story about, and who has the privilege of naming their identity? And is that a privilege? It's a privilege to be able to self-identify. So there are many questions that come to mind when we think about power through narrative and through story, and both fictionally and biblically, theologically, as well as through our experiences in the church and what stories are told or interpreted from those experiences? What are the guiding narratives? And I'm probably jumping ahead of my slides here, but I immediately think of the connections between where we were at the beginning with discernment, especially thought of negatively, is often associated with processes of LGBTQ inclusion. And one of the questions or reasons being is that some people are constructing a narrative or have the privilege of telling a story. And not only that, it's a story about others. So who has the privilege to claim their own narrative? And is discernment life-giving if it is not about telling a story about others? Those are questions. Let's flip back to my slides. So, stories and ethical arguments for peace, some questions here. What do the stories we tell and live by as Mennonites reveal about how we are shaped by and or how we understand truth and power for ethical living? The stories we tell about God, the world, our place in it, for example, creation, as well as stories about Jesus and who we are called to be as disciples, the church, are significant as they give way to particular moral commitments and particular understandings of the values we hold dearly, how justice is defined, how peace is defined, how love is defined. When doing ethics, it's always important to ask, whose story is this? Who is telling the story? What is at stake and for whom? How is peace understood? How is violence understood? Who gets to decide? So now I take this, in a way it's a methodological approach, and in a way it's a framing, and I combine it with another set of commitments, or a particular set of commitments. So storytelling plus liberative feminist commitments for ethics. So ask again, what are the stories that shape us? But asking that question by also applying a hermeneutics of suspicion for unequal and dominating relationships of power, and with a commitment to the well-being of all, which requires special attention to those who experience suffering and marginalization. We ask this question, what are the stories that shape us, with a commitment to also particular values. We could talk about it as doing ethics at and doing storytelling at the and with the intersections of power, with an analysis of the intersections of power and at the intersections of power. And what I mean by this would be having a bias for justice, centering differences, reading against the grain and moving marginalized voices to the center, challenging existing norms and definitions, resisting hierarchy, looking for an intersectional view of peace, and that considers how oppression and violence operate at the same time and overlapping. So here's my third part. So I have had that in the back of my mind and then had the experience of trying to play this out. So that's a lot. It's a lot of lofty commitments and norms and method. What does that actually look like in practice? Can it be life-giving? I don't have all the answers, but let's look at how this went. So, a case study of Shant's Mennonite Church in Baden, Ontario. Well, at Shant's, they were curious about, they had never had a formal discernment process on LGBTQ inclusion, to go back to that topic. And they wanted help with this, and they recognized that it would, because of the power dynamics within their congregation, they sought out, and you can talk about whether this is problematic or not, they sought out an expert of sorts in myself to help facilitate this conversation and also to be open to framing it differently. And I came into it too by saying, you know what? We can't do discernment. No more discernment. We're not going to discern anybody's morality as a person, assuming that we understand that sexuality is connected to one's humanity. So we need to talk about something else. Can we talk about how to celebrate theologically the sexual and gender diversity that's already among us? Can we take that as our starting point? This is a lot of words. I'll summarize it quickly. So in practice, what this looked like was I met with the church council for what you could call, and if you're familiar with the Quaker tradition, a seasoning process. So that is where you can have kind of a side conversation with a particular group to season the learning before you then bring it back to a bigger group. I was a facilitator and an educator in this capacity, resourcing the congregation with, I had less at stake in this conversation and could be hopefully viewed as someone who could helpfully guide others. I started by naming the fact that we can't frame this as a discussion about who of us doesn't fit existing norms regarding gender and sexuality, like I mentioned. We set ourselves up for failure that way, creating an us and a them. We can't assume that there is no sexual or gender diversity already among us. Rather, we assume the opposite. And we must not make anyone's humanity the topic of debate, as I mentioned. So from there, we established group norms and engaged in storytelling about, instead, our experiences of God in order to remind ourselves of who God is. So we will know better when we see and hear God speaking to us, and also how to celebrate our sexual and gender diversity. Of course, not all, there are many, many congregations that couldn't be at this starting point. Chance was already taking, they just wanted to know how to be more celebrative and integrative about their sexual and gender diversity. They accepted that. And we named what was at stake for us in the conversation, acknowledging that there were different things at stake for different people. So I named basic assumptions with them. And I can share these, I'll share these slides with you afterwards so you can read through them more closely. But the main point is that this was not discerning, really. It was educating. And you could say too that we're splitting hairs, and maybe we are doing some of what we meant by discerning previously. It's just that that word itself has become so problematic in people's experiences that it poses a barrier. So there's that too. So we were framing it, we were talking about the stories that form us and character formation, which includes with an awareness of the relationships of power among us and questions about whose story is being told and which version of the story is going to be normative. And we were looking at the Magnificat as one example to look at and learn about who God is. And we used circle process sharing for that. So again, in summary, we started with who is God, storytelling about our experiences of God to get at how to celebrate diversity through also our understanding of ecclesiology and who we're called to be. And then the implications for our ethics, it was really less of a question of, you might say, it was less of a question of ethics, except in the details, it was more about how do we express the ethics we already have. So the information that we discussed at church council was shared with the congregation during adult Sunday school classes, and then adult Sunday school leaders took up the responsibility to continue to find creative ways of living into this identity and this understanding of the story that forms us, and the particular values that they had named through this process. So finally, there's a lot there, but I want to hear from you. And these are some guiding questions that might get you started, or you might have your own comments or questions ready already. So thinking about what comes to mind for you when you hear the word discernment. Is what I'm saying resonating with you at all, or is it not? And that's okay. What have your experiences been like? Understanding perhaps your own social location as well. And what stories shape your ethics, or have you seen shape the ethics of your congregation? Those are some ways to get started. But I do think, just to reiterate, the difference between discernment as talking about others and making someone else's humanity the point of moral discernment, versus thinking through another issue or theme, and then simply the issue of the word itself and how, regardless of what it's used for, can it ever be redeemed based on its history. So